At a crowded school event where wealthy parents competed for attention, trading stories of private tutors and overseas summer programs, a young single father stood quietly in the corner of the room with his 6-year-old daughter. He wore a plain button-down shirt. His shoes were worn at the edges. His eyes were calm but guarded. When a powerful donor publicly mocked him in front of the entire crowd, not a single person spoke up. No one moved. No one dared. Until a well-known CEO walked through the door, crossed the room, and stood directly beside him and said something that made the entire room go silent. What do you think made a CEO stand beside that man? Stay with this story, the answer might surprise you. The morning of Innovation Day at Westbrook Academy arrived with the kind of crisp, golden light that made everything look more important than it was. The school, a private elementary institution nestled in an affluent suburb of Chicago, had spent 3 weeks preparing for the event. The gymnasium had been transformed. Long tables draped in white linen, soft track lighting aimed at student projects, and a banner stretched across the back wall that read, "Young Minds, Big Ideas." Parents had been invited to walk the floor, admire their children's work, and celebrate what the school's brochure called a community of achievement. By 9:30 in the morning, the room was already thick with the kind of energy that came less from genuine pride and more from quiet competition. Mothers in tailored blazers exchanged careful compliments. Fathers in pressed slacks spoke a little too loudly about their children's reading levels and after-school coding programs. Some families had arrived with professionally printed display boards. One project, a miniature solar-powered irrigation system, had clearly been assembled by someone far older than the 8-year-old standing beside it, beaming. Caleb Turner arrived at 9:47. He was 28 years old, with the kind of build that came from actual physical labor, not a gym, but from crouching under machinery, lifting panels, working with his hands in the dim back rooms of schools and warehouses. He wore a plain gray button-down shirt, tucked unevenly into dark trousers. His shoes were clean but visibly old, the leather at the toe creased with use. He didn't carry a coffee or wear a name badge. He had no display board under his arm, no rolling cart of supplies. He had one hand in his pocket, and the other holding his daughter's. Lily Turner was 6 years old and barely reached his elbow. She had her father's dark eyes, and her mother's a woman who was no longer in the picture. Soft, round face. She wore a yellow dress that Caleb had ironed that morning, pressing each fold carefully before school. In her arms, she carried her project. A small model built from recycled materials, wooden dowels, a few carefully bent pieces of aluminum foil, and a hand-drawn diagram taped to a piece of cardboard. It was the kind of thing a child made at a kitchen table over several evenings, piece by piece, with a father sitting nearby asking questions more than giving answers. Caleb scanned the room when they entered. His expression didn't change. He had learned, over years, to read spaces quickly to identify where the exits were, where the pressure points were, where the energy concentrated. He noticed the professionally printed displays immediately. He noticed the tailored blazers. He noticed the way 2 women near the entrance glanced at him, then at each other, then away. He said nothing. He guided Lily toward an open table near the far wall, away from the center of the room, and helped her set her project down. He straightened the cardboard backing. He adjusted the small diagram so it faced outward. Then he stepped back, put his hands in his pockets, and waited. Lily looked up at him. "Dad," she whispered, "is our thing okay? It looks different from everyone else's." Caleb looked at her project. He looked at the room. Then he crouched down to her level and said, simply, "Different isn't the same as wrong." She thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded, as though she had decided to believe him. He stood back up, and the morning continued. Within 20 minutes, the room had settled into a rhythm that felt less like an educational event and more like a social performance. Parents moved from table to table, offering studied admiration to the projects they recognized, pausing longer at the ones backed by visible investment. A boy named Marcus, whose father was a surgeon, had brought a working circuit board display with LED indicators that blinked in sequence. A girl named Sophia had a hand-bound book of original illustrations and a printed biography of her creative process. There was even a small drone, supervised closely by an intensely focused parent in a linen blazer, hovering briefly above a table to polite applause. Lily stood beside her project and watched people walk past. A few stopped. Most did not. Those who did gave her the kind of smile that was meant to be encouraging, but had a faint tightness at the edges, the smile adults gave when they didn't know what to say. One woman leaned in, studied the hand-drawn diagram, said, "Oh, how cute," and moved on. Lily didn't say anything. But she started turning the small aluminum piece in her fingers, around and around, the way she did when she was working something out inside her head. Caleb noticed. He always noticed. But he didn't move to intervene. He watched, and he waited, and he kept his hands in his pockets. That was when Richard Hayes arrived. The shift in the room was immediate. Not loud, nothing as blunt as applause, but a subtle gravitational pull, the way air moves when something heavy enters a space. Richard Hayes was 45, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the precise confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged anywhere. He wore a dark navy suit with a white pocket square and shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His hair was silver at the temples. His watch caught the track, lighting every time he moved his wrist. He was the school's largest private donor. He had personally funded the new science wing, the library renovation, and the outdoor learning pavilion. His name was on a plaque near the main entrance. The principal shook his hand for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Two teachers who had been in the middle of conversations with parents paused to acknowledge him. He moved through the room the way men like him always moved, not with hurry, but with the absolute certainty that the room would accommodate him. His eyes swept across the tables. When they reached Caleb and Lily's corner of the gymnasium, they stopped. Richard's expression didn't shift dramatically. It was subtler than that. It was the slight settling of the jaw, the faint narrowing of the eyes, the look of a man who had cataloged someone within 3 seconds and filed them under a category he didn't think much of. He glanced at Lily's project. He glanced at Caleb's shoes. He glanced back at Caleb's face. Caleb met his gaze, not with aggression, not with apology, just with the flat, steady look of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide. Richard held it for a moment, then looked away and continued across the room to speak with the principal. But the look had lasted long enough for the two women near the registration table to see it, long enough for a few nearby parents to notice the exchange and quietly draw the social conclusion that men like Richard Hayes were known for making without saying a word. The tension in the room had shifted, quietly, but unmistakably. The next 30 minutes were a slow accumulation of small cuts. A mother near the center of the room, tall, well-dressed, with the particular manner of someone who had been popular in every room she'd ever entered, began showing off her daughter's project, loudly enough for 2 adjacent tables to hear. It was an interactive map of world ecosystems, color-coded and laminated, with printed data cards that the child could flip through on request. The mother explained at some length that they had worked with a consultant from a local university. "We wanted Mia to really understand the research process," she said, her voice carrying across the gymnasium floor with practiced ease. A few parents murmured appreciation. Someone asked the name of the consultant. She answered without hesitation, smiling. Lily was standing 4 feet away. She heard every word. She looked down at her own project, the hand-bent aluminum, the cardboard backing, the diagram she had drawn in pencil and then traced over in blue marker, because her father said the lines should be clear. She picked up one of the wooden dowels and turned it slowly in her fingers. "Dad," she said quietly, "their project has a consultant." "I know," Caleb said. "What's a consultant?" He paused for exactly 1 second. "Someone who helps you build things you don't know how to build yourself." Lily considered that. "Did we use a consultant?" "No," he said. "We built it ourselves." She nodded, but her shoulders were slightly lower than they had been 10 minutes ago. The mother with the ecosystem map drifted closer to their table, the way people do at these events, moving through the space, under the premise of admiration but performing a kind of social geography, mapping who mattered and who didn't. She glanced at Lily's project. She glanced at Caleb. She leaned slightly toward the woman beside her and said, "Not quietly enough. I imagine they made it at home." Nothing wrong with that, of course. Not everyone has the same resources. The woman beside her nodded with the kind of gentle agreement that functioned as agreement without wanting to be held responsible for it. Caleb heard it. He knew Lily heard it too. He didn't respond. He didn't look at the woman. He shifted his weight slightly, put one hand briefly on Lily's shoulder, just resting it there, barely a touch, and then withdrew it. What he did not do was tell Lily that the comment was ignorant. He did not explain that the model she was holding contained a functional load distribution concept he had spent 4 evenings working through with her, letting her make the design decisions and correcting only what would have caused it to collapse. He did not mention that the aluminum configuration she had bent herself, guided by questions, not by instructions replicated, in simplified form, a principle used in modular structural engineering. He said none of that, because he never talked about himself, and because he didn't believe in defending things that would eventually be understood without defense. But something was happening inside Lily that he couldn't stop with silence alone. He could see it in the way she stood, slightly angled away from the open room now, her body curving inward as though she was beginning to protect something she wasn't sure was worth protecting. That was what it looked like when a 6-year-old started to doubt herself. And that was the thing, the one thing, that Caleb Turner had never been able to stay entirely calm about. Richard Hayes made a second pass through the room at 10:30. He moved slower this time, pausing longer at each table, asking questions that were framed as interest but carried the particular weight of judgment. He complimented a project by noting how polished it was. He asked one father about the enrichment school his child attended. He laughed at something a mother said, and the laugh was warm and easy and perfectly calibrated. Then he arrived at the corner of the gymnasium where Caleb and Lily stood. He stopped in front of their table. He looked at the project for a moment. He looked at Lily, who looked back at him with the careful, watchful expression of a child who had learned to read adults quickly. Then he looked at Caleb. "Nice to see all kinds of families represented," Richard said. His voice was pleasant. That was the worst part of it, how pleasant it was. "And what does Dad do for work?" The question was directed at Lily, but the eyes were on Caleb. Caleb answered directly. "Mechanical engineering, freelance work, equipment repair, and systems designed for educational facilities." Richard raised his eyebrows, not in surprise, but in the way a man raises his eyebrows when he's about to perform surprise. "Oh, educational facilities. Like fixing things, design and repair," Caleb said. "Both." Richard nodded slowly, as though processing something deeply considered. Right. "And the project, did you two build this together?" "Yes," Lily said. Her voice was steady but small. "That's sweet," Richard said. "Very homemade." He tilted his head slightly and looked at the diagram. "What's it supposed to demonstrate?" Lily explained it. She was good at explaining things she had practiced on her father, who always asked follow-up questions she had to actually think about. She talked about the load distribution. She talked about how the bent aluminum pieces transferred force differently depending on their angle. She used words that were slightly too technical for her age, but she used them correctly. Richard listened with an expression of patient tolerance. When she finished, he said, "Well, that's a lot for a little girl to take on." He smiled at Caleb. "You must have done most of the heavy thinking." "She did most of it," Caleb said. Richard chuckled, a light, dismissive sound, the kind designed to suggest that the person speaking was being charmingly naive. Of course. He straightened up, adjusted his jacket, and looked around the gymnasium for a moment, as though orienting himself in a more important conversation. Then he looked back at Caleb. "Can I offer some friendly advice?" he asked. Caleb said nothing, which Richard took as a yes. Events like this, they're really about community, about shared values. Families come here because they're invested in a certain kind of environment for their children. He paused. It's not about any one project. It's about belonging to something. He looked at Caleb's shirt. at his shoes, and then, with the particular calm of a man who had never once paid a social consequence for anything he said, he added, "Maybe not every family is the right fit for this kind of setting, and that's okay. There's no shame in it." A few people nearby heard it. A few people smiled, not openly, but with the faint, guilty amusement of those who would later tell themselves they hadn't been laughing at anything. Lily made a sound, a small, involuntary intake of breath. Her eyes filled immediately, the way a child's eyes fill when they are ambushed by an emotion they were not prepared for. Caleb crouched down. He was at eye level with her in one motion, smoothly, without a word to Richard or to anyone else in the room. He took both of her hands in his. He said something to her very quietly, something no one else could hear. Whatever it was 3 or 4 words. And it was enough. The tears didn't fall. He stood back up. He did not look at Richard. He did not say a single word. The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room without being called. Most of the nearby parents had heard. Some had seen Lily's face. None of them spoke. The woman who had made the comment about resources looked away and found something interesting in her phone. The father with the circuit board display adjusted something on his son's table that didn't need adjusting. The principal, who was on the far side of the room and had not witnessed the exchange directly, continued chatting with a teacher about the outdoor learning pavilion. Richard Hayes drifted away from the table, naturally, without acknowledgement. He returned to a conversation with 2 other donors near the center of the gymnasium, and his voice resumed its easy, self-assured cadence. The cadence of a man for whom scenes like the one he had just created were not scenes at all, but simply the natural exercise of social order. Caleb stood at his daughter's side. He did not cross his arms. He did not tighten his jaw. He did not scan the room the way a man does when he is deciding whether to respond. He stood the way he always stood, hands at his sides, eyes forward, weight evenly distributed, and he breathed. What no one in the room understood, watching him, was that what looked like passivity was not passivity at all. Caleb Turner had learned, over years of working in environments where people underestimated him, where his quiet manner was mistaken for blankness, his patience for weakness, his refusal to perform intelligence for a lack of it, that reaction was often the thing that cost you the most. Not because silence was cowardice, but because silence, in the right moment, was its own kind of precision instrument. It cost nothing to deploy. It revealed nothing that needed protecting. And it left everything in the room, including the people who had just done something unkind, to sit with what they had done in the stillness of their own heads. But that was his calculation. His logic, not Lily's. Lily was 6 years old, and what Lily felt, standing in the yellow dress she had been so careful about that morning, holding the project she had worked on for 11 evenings across 3 weeks, what she felt was the first real, clean sting of being told, by someone powerful, that she did not belong. She had not cried. She had not run. She had held her father's hands for a moment, listened to whatever he had said, and then she had straightened her back and stood beside her project again. That composure, in a 6-year-old, was both beautiful and quietly devastating to observe. Caleb knew what that composure was costing her. He knew because he had built it in her not by protecting her from hard moments, but by being present in them, by letting her see that you could stand straight when the world told you to fold. He had taught her that. He was proud that she was doing it. He was also very aware that there was a limit to what a 6-year-old could hold. So he stood beside her, closely, not hovering. He was not a man who hovered, but present in the way that mattered. Present in the way that said, without words, "I am here. Whatever comes next, I am right here." The room moved around them. Conversations continued. Someone laughed on the other side of the gymnasium. And Caleb waited. She arrived at 10:52, according to the clock above the gymnasium entrance. No one announced her. No shift in the room's energy preceded her. She came through the side door rather than the main entrance, and she was dressed in the kind of way that could read as either casual or deliberately understated dark slacks, a simple structured blazer, the color of slate, flat leather shoes. No jewelry except a single thin bracelet. Her hair was pulled back. She wore no lanyard, no name tag, no sign of affiliation. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She was 27 years old. She was the founder and chief executive officer of Aeon Learning Technologies, a company that, in the past 3 years, had become one of the most closely watched names in educational technology investment circles. 2 months earlier, she had been on the cover of a national business publication under the headline, "The Youngest CEO Reshaping How America Learns." 3 of her company's systems were currently running pilot programs in public school districts across 4 states. None of that was visible when she walked into the gymnasium. She moved through the room without stopping to speak to anyone. She looked at the projects. She read the cards. She crouched briefly beside one table to examine the work at eye level, the way an engineer does not for aesthetics, but for structure. She moved methodically, not quickly, starting at the left side of the room and working her way across. A few parents glanced at her. Some tried to place her face. One woman leaned toward her husband and murmured something. He shrugged. Evelyn did not make eye contact with anyone until she was ready to. She reached the table in the far right corner at 11:04. She stopped. She did not say anything for a moment. She stood in front of Lily's project and looked at it with the kind of attention that most people in the room had not given it. Not polite attention, not the performative attention of an adult humoring a child, but the specific, narrowed, genuinely activated attention of someone who had recognized something. Lily was watching her. Evelyn looked at the hand-bent aluminum pieces. She looked at the wooden dowels and the way they intersected at the load-bearing points. She looked at the diagram, the penciled lines, the blue marker traced over them, the labeled arrows indicating force direction. Her head tilted slightly to one side. "Can you tell me about this?" she said. She was speaking to Lily, but her eyes moved briefly to Caleb, acknowledging his presence the way you acknowledge a counterpart before a meeting. Lily explained again. She told it the same way she had told it before, with the same words in roughly the same sequence, because she had thought through the explanation and believed in it. The load distribution, the angle of force transfer, the reason the aluminum bent the way it did, and what it meant for the structure's integrity under weight. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When Lily finished, she said, "And whose idea was the angle on the end brackets?" "Mine," Lily said. "But Dad asked me why first, and I had to figure out the answer." Evelyn looked at Caleb. "She said you asked her why," Evelyn said. "Before you told her the answer, if you give someone the answer," Caleb said, "they remember the answer. If you ask them why, they figure out the principle. She'll be able to apply it to something completely different next year." There was a pause. Evelyn studied him the way she studied the project, not curiously, but analytically. The way you look at something when you are trying to determine whether what you are seeing is what you think it is. "What kind of engineering?" she asked. "Mechanical. Systems design. I do a lot of modular structural work for educational facilities, modifying existing equipment for durability and adaptability." She nodded once, slowly. Something had shifted in her attention, a deepening, a refocusing. She looked back at the project. She looked at the diagram again. "Where did the load distribution model come from?" she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "I designed it. About 3 years ago. For a different application." Evelyn looked at him. She asked 2 more questions, short ones, technical, the kind you only knew to ask if you had spent real time inside the problem. The first was about tolerance variance in the aluminum bends, specifically, how small a deviation in angle would begin to compromise the load transfer efficiency. Caleb answered in 4 sentences. He gave her the figure, explained the testing methodology he had used to arrive at it, mentioned the material grade that offered the best balance of flexibility and structural integrity, and noted the one condition under which the tolerance became critical. The second question was about scalability, whether the concept worked at larger dimensions, and where the engineering logic broke down if you pushed the ratio past a certain threshold. Caleb answered that in 3 sentences. He didn't use notes. He didn't pause to recall. He spoke the way people speak about things they understand from the inside out, not by retrieval, but by comprehension. Evelyn did not react visibly. She absorbed both answers and was still for a moment. Her eyes moved back to Lily's model. She looked at the diagram again, specifically at the corner where the hand-drawn arrows indicated force redirection through the bent brackets. It was a 6-year-old's drawing. The proportions were slightly off. The letters were uneven. But the structural logic, the arrows described the directionality, the distribution pathway, the way the system converted vertical load into lateral tension across the base. That logic was correct. Not approximately correct. Precisely correct. In the way that a simplified model is precise when the person who designed its underlying architecture knows exactly what they simplified and why. Evelyn had spent 6 months working with a team of engineers on a modular frame system for deployable classroom structures, environments that could be assembled quickly, adapted to uneven ground, and broken down and transported without heavy equipment. The core challenge had been load distribution at the bracket joints. The solution her team had eventually settled on, after considerable iteration, involved a specific angle of force transfer that looked functionally, structurally, in terms of engineering logic, very similar to what was diagrammed on this hand-drawn cardboard in blue marker. She had seen the origin of that solution in a technical document 18 months ago. It had come through a contract pipeline, attributed to a freelance engineer. She looked at Caleb. "I think I've seen your work before," she said. Her voice was level, not dramatic, just precise. Caleb looked at her without changing his expression. "That's possible. Aeon Learning Technologies," she said. "We licensed a structural concept for modular classroom frames about 18 months ago through a freelance engineering contract." There was a long pause. "I didn't know it went to your company specifically," Caleb said. "It did." She paused. "We've been using a variation of it in 3 pilot programs. It's in the framing system for our deployable classroom units." Lily had been listening to this conversation with the focused patience of a child who understood that something important was happening, even if she couldn't map all of it. She looked up at her father. His expression had not changed. He was looking at Evelyn with the same steady attention he gave to everything. Not modest, not proud, just present. "Why didn't you follow up on the contract?" Evelyn asked. "We left an open inquiry." "I saw it," Caleb said. "I wasn't in a position to take on full-time consulting work at the time." There was a second pause, different from the first one. Evelyn glanced at Lily. Briefly, the briefest glance, but not a casual one. A connecting glance. The kind that placed a data point next to another data point and drew the line between them. Then she looked back at the room, at the long tables with their polished displays and professionally printed cards, at the cluster of parents near the center, laughing at something Richard Hayes had said. At the gymnasium, with its track lighting and its linen-covered tables and its quiet, well-maintained atmosphere of competitive belonging, she looked back at Caleb. "I think," she said quietly, "that I arrived at a good time." Richard Hayes had circled back. It was the kind of circulation that powerful men in social spaces performed not because they were particularly interested in anyone they passed, but because the room was theirs to move through, and movement itself was a form of ownership. He was speaking with 2 parents when his eye caught Evelyn standing in the far corner, her attention fixed on the one table in the room that no one with any social instinct would have flagged as significant. He excused himself and walked over. "Don't think we've met," he said, extending a hand toward Evelyn with the easy confidence of a man who assumed introductions were always his to initiate. "Richard Hayes. I'm one of the primary supporters of Westbrook's programs." Evelyn looked at his hand. Shook it once. Evelyn Carter. No title. No context. Just the name. Richard smiled, the way he smiled at people he had categorized as professionally adjacent, but not quite relevant. "Wonderful event, isn't it? Great to see the families involved." His eyes moved briefly to Caleb, the glance of a man revisiting a prior conclusion. "I was just speaking with this gentleman earlier. Very committed to the DIY approach." The inflection on those last 3 words was light. Perfectly light. The kind of light that functioned as weight. Evelyn did not respond to the observation. She looked at Richard with the expression she used in meetings when someone had said something she was choosing not to engage with directly yet. "I'd actually like to finish my conversation," she said. Not unkindly, just as a statement of fact. Richard's smile held, but something behind it recalibrated. He was not accustomed to being redirected by someone younger and quieter and less visibly powerful than himself. He glanced at Caleb again, then at Lily's project, and said because he could not resist it, because men like Richard Hayes had never developed the reflex to resist it. "I was just noting to our friend here that not every family is the right fit for this kind of setting. A question of values and environment." He smiled at Lily, the way adults smile at children when they are using them as props. Nothing personal. Evelyn was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" The question was quiet, not rhetorical, not aggressive. It was asked with the precise, flat clarity of someone who had already decided that the answer was no and was giving the other person one opportunity to change that. Richard blinked. "I'm sorry? Do you know who this man is?" Evelyn said. She was looking at Richard, but her body language, the angle of her shoulders, the placement of her feet had shifted so that she was standing beside Caleb. Not behind him, not in front of him, beside him. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. "Caleb Turner," she said, addressing the small cluster of people who had now drifted close enough to hear, because rooms like this always produced witnesses for moments that mattered. "Developed a structural engineering concept approximately 3 years ago for modular load-bearing systems. That concept was licensed for use by my company, Aeon Learning Technologies, which, if you're not familiar, is currently running educational technology programs in 47 schools across 4 states. She paused. "The framing system for our deployable classroom units is built on his design." No one spoke. Richard's expression had not yet landed anywhere definitive. It was suspended in the space between the version of the moment he had expected and the version that was actually happening. "He turned down a full consulting contract with us," Evelyn continued, her voice unchanged, "because he had other priorities." She did not look at Lily when she said this. She didn't need to. The room, the 7 or 8 people who had positioned themselves close enough to be witnesses, had gone still in the way that rooms go, still when the social architecture of a moment collapses and has to be rebuilt from different materials. Richard Hayes stood very straight. The pocket square was still perfectly positioned. The watch still caught the light. Nothing on the outside had changed. But something behind the eyes, that easy, unquestioned certainty that the room was his to define, had shifted. Slightly. Undeniably. He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him. Same steady expression, same even weight distribution, same hands at his sides, as though nothing particularly important had happened. As though this moment, which had just publicly dismantled 6 weeks of accumulated small humiliations, was simply a continuation of the morning. The silence held for what felt longer than it was. Then, slowly, the room resumed. Not with the comfortable ease of before something had shifted, and everyone in the immediate vicinity felt it, but with the careful, calibrated normality of people who were processing new information while trying to appear as though they were simply continuing their morning. 2 parents near the adjacent table turned back to each other and began speaking, but quietly, and the conversation had the particular undertone of people who were updating their assessments in real time. The woman who had commented about resources had moved to the other side of the gymnasium, without anyone noticing exactly when she had gone. Richard Hayes had not moved. He stood with the composed stillness of a man who was very good at not showing what he was feeling, which was considerable. Evelyn spoke to Caleb again, lower now, outside the performance of the prior moment. "We never formally closed the inquiry," she said. "Your name is still active in our licensing database." "I know," Caleb said. "Would you consider a conversation? Not a contract offer. Just a conversation about where the technology has gone and where we're trying to take it." Caleb was quiet. He looked at Lily, who was looking at the floor in the particular way of children who are listening very carefully to adult conversations and trying not to be noticed doing so. "I'd consider a conversation," he said. Evelyn nodded. It was Richard who spoke next, and the fact that he spoke at all was itself significant. It meant that something in him was working toward a correction, however uncomfortable the mechanics of that process were. "I wasn't aware of your background," he said to Caleb. His voice had changed. The pleasant weight of it was still there, but the easiness had been replaced by something more effortful. "I may have spoken out of turn." Caleb looked at him. The look lasted long enough to be clear and short enough to be merciful. "My daughter worked on that project for 11 evenings, Caleb said. Not loudly, not with heat. She designed the bracket angle herself. I asked her questions. She figured out the answers." He looked at Lily. "That's what the project is about." Richard said nothing. "It's not about me," Caleb said. "It was never about me." That sentence did something to the people nearby that no dramatic confrontation could have. It was too plain, too precise, too entirely without performance. It landed in the room and sat there, and the people who heard it, the parents, the teachers, the two women who had drifted close at some point during the preceding minutes, felt it the way you feel. A sentence that tells you something true about yourself that you have been successfully avoiding. The woman who had made the comment about resources had not left the gymnasium. She had simply moved. She was now standing near the water station at the far wall, and from that position she could see the corner table clearly. She watched Caleb and Lily. She watched the way he stood beside the project, the same way he had been standing for the past hour, without defense, without apology, without any effort to occupy more space than he needed. She thought about what she had said, not just the words, the manner, the way she had leaned toward the woman beside her, the conspiratorial smallness of the voice, the certainty with which she had dismissed something she had not taken 4 seconds to actually look at. She thought about her own daughter's project, the ecosystem map, the university consultant, the laminated cards, and she thought about what it meant that she had considered that a product of her child's work in any meaningful sense, while dismissing, without examination, a project built by a 6-year-old under the guidance of a father who had spent 11 evenings asking questions rather than providing answers. She set down her water cup. She walked across the gymnasium floor. She stopped at the table in the corner. "I'm sorry," she said. She was speaking to both of them, to Caleb and to Lily. "I said something unkind earlier, and I shouldn't have." Lily looked up at her with the careful, assessing gaze of a child who was deciding whether to accept something. Caleb nodded once. "Thank you," he said. It was the full extent of his response. No magnanimity speech, no gracious reassurance. Just 2 words, offered directly, because that was what the moment required and not a syllable more. The woman nodded. She turned and walked back across the gymnasium. At 11:40, the formal portion of Innovation Day concluded with brief remarks from the principal and a round of applause for all participating students. The track lighting held steady. The gymnasium began its slow transition from event to aftermath, parents collecting displays, children looking for their things, the early leavers gathering their coats by the side doors. Lily had been quiet since the exchange with Richard Hayes, not unhappy, not the tight inward quiet of a child who is suppressing something, but the slower, more expansive quiet of a child who is rearranging information. She had been watching the room since Evelyn spoke. She had been watching her father. She had been watching Richard Hayes, who had not left the gymnasium but had not returned to their table, and whose posture, still straight, still composed, carried something different now, some invisible redistribution of weight. She stood beside her project and looked at her father. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Why didn't you tell them?" she asked. "About the thing you made, the one the lady uses." Caleb looked at her. "'Cause it wasn't the point, but it would have made them stop." "Maybe," he said. "But then they would have treated us differently because of what I built, not because of what you built." He gestured, barely perceptibly, at her project. "This is yours. I didn't want it to get buried under mine." Lily thought about that for a long moment, her head slightly tilted, the way she tilted it when she was genuinely working through something. "You wanted people to see my thing," she said slowly. "Not your thing." "Yeah." She looked at the project. She looked at the room. She looked back at her father. "Okay," she said. Evelyn, who had stayed in the corner of the gymnasium during the principal's remarks, approached them as the crowd began to disperse. She crouched slightly to be at Lily's eye level, not the condescending crouch of an adult performing accessibility, but the direct crouch of someone who wanted genuine contact. "Your bracket angle," she said to Lily. "The one you said you figured out yourself." "Yes," Lily said. "I have engineers who've been working on a version of that problem for months," Evelyn said. "And they solved it a different way than you did. But your way is more elegant." Lily blinked. "What does elegant mean? Like pretty?" "In engineering," Evelyn said, "it means it does what it needs to do with the least amount of extra effort. Clean, direct, nothing wasted." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what Dad always says. Don't add anything you don't need." Evelyn looked up at Caleb. There was something in her expression that wasn't quite a smile. It was more composed than that, more contained, but it held the unmistakable quality of genuine regard. The kind of regard that comes from recognizing something rare and knowing you are recognizing it. "She's going to be extraordinary," she said. Caleb looked at his daughter. Lily was examining the bracket joint on her model, with the focused, proprietary attention of someone who had just been told that a thing they made was worth examining closely. He reached over and took her hand. Not a protective gesture, not a shielding or a sheltering, just a hand, around her hand, the two of them standing beside the thing they had made together over 11 evenings at a kitchen table, in a gymnasium that had spent most of the morning insisting it had no place for them. Lily didn't look up. She kept studying the bracket, but she curled her fingers around his. "I know," he said quietly. He wasn't saying it to Evelyn. He wasn't saying it for the room. He was saying it the way he said most things, directly, with precision, to the only person it was meant for. Lily looked up then, and what was in her face, the particular, fierce, uncomplicated thing that lived behind a 6-year-old's eyes when she looks at her father and feels, without words, that the whole difficult morning has resolved into something true that was the moment. That was the entire morning, distilled. 2 weeks after Innovation Day, Caleb Turner met with Evelyn Carter in a conference room on the 14th floor of Aon Learning Technologies' Chicago office. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 19 minutes. He came alone. He wore the same kind of clothes he always wore, neat, plain, functional. He brought a notebook dense with handwritten calculations and a small folder of printed diagrams. He did not bring a portfolio, a presentation deck, or a business card. He had been invited to a conversation, and he had prepared for a conversation. Evelyn had her full engineering team present. 2 of them, she would mention later, had specifically requested the meeting after she described the exchange at Westbrook. One of the engineers, a woman who had been working on the load distribution problem for the better part of a year, asked Caleb a technical question in the first 10 minutes that most people in the room could not have fully parsed. He answered it without pausing. The conversation was long and technical and, at times, argumentative in the productive way of people who respected each other's thinking enough to push back on it. Evelyn had been in rooms with skilled engineers before. She had not, before that morning in the gymnasium, fully anticipated how different it would feel to be in a room with someone who was not only technically fluent, but genuinely indifferent to impressing her. Near the end of the meeting, she offered him a formal consulting arrangement. The terms were generous. The scope was significant. The flexibility was real. Caleb looked at the terms. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he was interested, with 2 conditions. The first condition was that his schedule remained structured around school hours and school commitments. He had drop-off at 7:50 and pick-up at 3:15 5 days a week. Any meetings, calls, or deadlines that required him to compromise that structure would need to be rescheduled. The second condition was more specific. He said that he had been working, independently, on a set of engineering principles for educational spaces, principles focused on adaptability, material accessibility, and ease of reconstruction by non-specialists. The idea was that schools in lower resource environments should be able to implement the same structural quality as well-funded facilities, using locally available materials and basic tools. He had been developing the framework for 3 years. He wanted it to be part of any arrangement they made. Not as a side project, he said. As a condition. There was a pause. One of the engineers at the table said, carefully, "That's a significant constraint on commercial application." "Yes," Caleb said. Evelyn looked at him. Then she looked at the terms document on the table. "We can work with that," she said. She meant it. Not as a concession, but as a recognition. The same recognition she had felt in the gymnasium, standing in front of a hand-drawn diagram made by a 6-year-old, whose father had spent 3 years building a professional framework out of the principle that technical quality should not be a function of available resources. The arrangement was formalized 2 weeks later. At Westbrook Academy, the period following Innovation Day was marked by a subtle but genuine shift. The principal sent a personal note to Caleb, acknowledging that the school's community values statement would benefit from a review. 3 parents reached out individually, some to apologize, some simply to introduce themselves properly, as though a second introduction could quietly replace the first. Richard Hayes did not reach out immediately. He did, eventually 43 days after the event, in a message that was careful and formal and technically constituted an apology without using the word wrong. Caleb read it. He did not respond at length. He wrote, "Thank you for reaching out. That was all." Because the morning at Westbrook was not, finally, about Richard Hayes. It was not about Evelyn Carter, or the engineers, or the social reordering of a gymnasium on a Tuesday in autumn. It was about a 6-year-old girl in a yellow dress, standing beside something she had built, in a room that had told her it didn't matter, and the father who had stood quietly at her side and known, without drama and without announcement, that she would carry that morning somewhere inside her for the rest of her life. Not the humiliation, not the silence of the room, not even the moment when a woman in a slate-colored blazer had said her work was elegant. What Lily Turner would carry was simpler than all of that. She would carry the 11 evenings at the kitchen table, the questions her father had asked instead of giving answers, the bent aluminum brackets she had decided on herself, with him sitting nearby, unhurried, asking her why, and the hand, his hand, around hers when the morning had resolved into something true. That was the whole of it. That was everything.